I'm going to invite our next panelists up, Winson and Kelvin, and this is our first session where we're going to be beaming in a virtual participant too. So to our wonderful friends at the back, we can make that happen. So as Kelvin and Winson are getting situated, I'm just going to introduce these next panels. The need for more and different types of data in clinical trials is driven by the goal of improving the quality, applicability, and relevance of trial results, making healthcare more personalized, effective, and cost-efficient. This ensures that medical treatments are safe and effective, not just in controlled trial settings, but also in real-world clinical practice. So our next two sessions will address the work that is being done to collect new and different types of data in clinical trials, in the practice environment, and outside of the institutional healthcare setting, and the opportunities and challenges associated with this. So the first of our panel is entitled Control Setting Data Does Not Equal Real-World Data, Breadth of Data, and Real-World Inspiration. Now, have we got Vishal with us as well? Is he here?
I'm here.
There he is. There we go. The system is working. So I'd like to introduce you to our three panelists, beginning with Dr. Winson Cheung, who, by the way, has also been a magnificent co-chair of this conference since inception. So thank you, Winson, for your continued commitment to the work that's done here. Dr. Cheung is a senior medical oncologist and real-world data scientist. He is currently a full professor in the departments of oncology, medicine, and community health sciences at the University of Calgary, where he is also the provincial director and chair of the Health Services Research and Real-World Evidence Generation Program. Dr. Cheung's main research interest is in health outcomes research and RWE generation across all cancer types, including solid tumors and hematologic malignancies. With him is Dr. Kelvin Chan, who is a medical oncologist with Sunnybrook Odette Cancer Center. Dr. Chan is a medical oncologist with Sunnybrook, professor at the University of Toronto, and an associate scientist at the Sunnybrook Research Institute. He specializes in GI, head and neck oncology. And coming to us virtually, is he still here? Have we lost him?
Yes. I'm still here.
Yeah, that's Dr. Vishal Navani, hopefully. Who is also a medical oncologist at the Tom Baker Cancer Center and an associate professor at the University of Calgary. He holds both membership of the Royal College of Physicians of the United Kingdom and fellowship of the Royal Australasian College of Physicians. Winson is actually going to be chairing this panel, and so I'll pass it over to you, Winson.
Great, thank you so much. It's always a privilege to be here, and I'm happy to be chairing this panel with my colleagues. So I think I'll start things off with a brief talk, just to kind of set the stage and calibrate everybody's understanding in terms of real-world data and real-world evidence. So next slide. Perfect. So I think earlier this morning, you heard one of our speakers, Francois, talk about A Tale of Two Cities. And I have to say that whenever I'm asked to speak about RWE in a clinical trials conference, I feel that might be the case as well. Some of you may be wondering why this topic has emerged as such an important and relevant topic nowadays. And I think throughout my training, I've also been asked a lot to I've been asked a question a lot in terms of how my research findings can be translated to the bedside. And more now, I think the reverse is also true. Can there be bedside learnings or things that we are doing in the bedside that can be used to inform research or our future studies? And I think that is definitely relevant here today as well. And finally, I would also compel you that as we kind of go over some of the ongoing RWE initiatives that we are currently doing, perhaps you can also interpret a lot of what I'm talking about through the clinical trials lens, because I do think there is significant overlap between the two realms of research. And for example, oftentimes you are collecting PRO data or quality of life data. Trials also do that. So I do think there is significant redundancy in terms of what we do, and perhaps there could be a lot more efficiencies to be gained as we work together. So in terms of what I want to achieve over the next 10 minutes or so before handing over to Vish and Kelvin, I do want to again align on what I am referring to when I talk about RWD data and RWE evidence. And as I alluded to earlier, I would also highlight some examples in terms of what we're currently doing in routine clinical practice in terms of data collection and how this might supplement our understanding of clinical trials and how we conduct clinical trials as we move forward. Next slide. All right. So what is real-world data? I'm probably preaching to the converted. Most of you probably have heard of this term before. And I think the reason why it's become so topical in recent years is because we are increasingly aware of the fact that clinical trial participants are very different from who we see in clinical practice. There is significant heterogeneity in terms of who we encounter and who we treat. They're not the same. And the anecdote I tell a lot of my trainees is that I've been doing this for the last 10, 15 years, and for a very long time, it was not called RWD or E, it was called health outcomes research, and certainly when I first started out, it was a lot of cheerleading and explaining in terms of what I do. Is it just an Excel spreadsheet? Am I just playing with data? And to industry's credit, I think it's been rebranded as RWE over the last 5 years or so, and that's really, I think, clarified to many stakeholders why it's important and how it might fill a gap in terms of what a clinical trial may not answer. Having lots of trouble with this clicker. Next slide. So over time, I would say, is no longer an afterthought. I think conventionally, once a clinical trial has been done, I get approached a lot in terms of doing database analysis to either confirm or refute the clinical trial findings. Are the interventions that we are using, do they actually translate to, do they actually translate? Does the efficacy that's been proven in trials, does it actually yield the effectiveness that we're looking for in the real world? So that was what used to happen. More and more now, I would say that RWE is thought of throughout the life cycle of all the clinical trial phases. Not only can it be used to confirm or refute clinical trial findings, but it can also be used and leveraged to inform how we design a phase 1 or phase 2 trial. So I do think it is now thought of and thought of deliberately along the whole trajectory of clinical trial conduct. Next slide. So what's the real reasons why real-world data has become very important and relevant? I do think real-world data encompasses all patients, not just the select few that can participate in trials. So because of that, it's usually population-based and also, population-based. So because of that, it's less prone to selection bias. I would also say because many databases do capture data from cradle to grave, it can also capture a wider breadth of data, not only focused on treatments that are investigated in a trial setting, but also radiation data, surgical data. In Canada, at least, many clinicians are salaried, and because of that, they're not incentivized to prescribe. And because of that, it is felt that because of this notion, the data are more reflective of what actually happens. And finally, because of clinical trials are typically finite in terms of duration, it doesn't always answer queries that relate to long-term follow-up or long-term outcomes. So again, RWD and E can certainly address gaps in that knowledge to look at late effects, both in terms of outcomes and survival, as well as toxicities. Still not working. All Now, having said that, I think there are some caveats, and I think this is the real reason why I think real-world data, I said earlier, has done wonders for my job in terms of no longer needing to explain what I do. But having said that, yeah, it is a big catch-all term, and because of that, there are some caveats to this label. Now when I go to a conference, invariably half the posters I see in the poster session have the term real-world attached to it, and I think it is sort of a double-edged sword because there's good and bad RWE and RWD. And some of the limitations of using these data sources are the following. Oftentimes, there needs to be significant infrastructure that needs to be in place before we can collect and curate data. There can also be long intervals between when an event happens and when we actually get the data for that event. Data can often be very, very messy and very, very complex. So, adequate quality control and assurance measures must be met as well. Obviously, data are only as useful as how we analyze it. So because of that, advanced analytics skills are also needed. And as I already alluded to, the actual process of collecting data and curating data can be very resource intensive. So what are we currently doing to hopefully further this area? Here are the three or four, a handful of topics I'll kind of briefly touch upon, just because I have limited time. One is about embedding data collection at the bedside. I do want to maybe briefly touch upon patient support programs and also outcomes-based agreements. And then, if time permits, I'll briefly highlight the role of real-time data capture as well as learning health systems, which you heard about earlier already. So many hospitals right now are introducing new EMRs or new EHRs, and by the very nature of the fact that these are very complex systems, they do collect lots of data. Not all of them are readily useful or accessible, but having said that, I think they are getting better in terms of collecting data at the bedside as it pertains to patient demographics, cancer characteristics, treatment data, as well as outcomes data. So these should and can be leveraged to answer important clinical questions. I do want to speak briefly about patient-reported outcomes. So in a few provinces across Canada now, PROs, as they're known, are collected on a routine basis. In Alberta, all patients who come to clinic are asked to complete an inventory of symptom assessments and surveys as a part of their routine care. And over time, we're also hoping to integrate in between clinic assessments. So not only when they see us, but also when they're at home. And the idea here is that the type, the number, intensity of these, the intensity of these symptoms may sometimes prompt automatic referrals to either specialized care, such as pain services, urgent care clinics, or even clinical trials. So again, I mentioned earlier in my talk that quality of life metrics are also sometimes part of this battery of surveys. And in a clinical trial setting, quality of life is also very important and very relevant. So I do wonder whether there's some redundancy there that could be addressed, and perhaps the overlap there might mitigate the need to collect a similar outcomes in a trial setting. There's also patient support programs. So in Canada, oftentimes there's a significant lag between when a trial demonstrates a drug is effective to when it's actually publicly reimbursed. So as a bridging mechanism, many industry partners do build and offer what we call PSPs to allow clinicians and patients to get familiar with the new drug. As part of these programs, data are often collected. Not always usable, but they are collected, and the goal now is to how can we streamline that process so that we are collecting useful data. So our group in Alberta have been able to leverage these PSP data to answer some questions, and now there's talk about linking these PSP data with admin data or survey data to further enhance the robustness and comprehensiveness of these data sets. Outcomes-based agreements is also a good example of how routine data collection can inform care. So for those who are less familiar, these are agreements whereby a drug is used, we collect data on the outcomes of these drugs. And if the outcomes are positive or meaningful, then perhaps it might lead to reimbursement of the drug. And the corollary is that if the outcomes are not as good, the drug is not as effective, perhaps it may lead to a refund or a rebate of the drug. Again, this does rely on data collection in the real world, and at least in some jurisdictions, there have been examples of this happening already. There really isn't a recent oncology example in Canada, but certainly in other countries, it has happened. A common question I get is, well, can we collect data in real time? Many of us do wear Fitbits or Apple Watches, so there's significant interest in terms of leveraging that to generate more up-to-date and current data. There's also been lots of work in terms of the using of AI to further mine existing data. So examples of this are pathology reports and imaging reports. Oftentimes they're reams of free text, so can we use technology to really harness that free text and translate that to more structured information to make it more usable. And again, quite a few speakers earlier mentioned the learning health system, and I think they had described the learning health system more at a macro level, meaning, if we do a study, can the study findings actually impact guidelines and impact care pathways? At the bedside, I would say we're also looking at this at a more micro level. Can we use data from the patient in front of us to inform care of the next patient? So there's lots of work in Alberta as well to hopefully operationalize this concept. But again, it's still a work in progress, and I would think that the time horizon for this to happen is still a few years away. So really, my team in Alberta, this is really the framework that we've been using to hopefully not only embed data collection in our day-to-day clinics, but really embedding analytics to translate these data into usable evidence, and then using this evidence to not only impact patient care at the point of care, but also using this information to inform the design of future trials. So it is a very proactive process that I think will come to fruition in the coming years. So again, that was, I think, a very high-level kind of whirlwind sort of look in terms of some of the ongoing initiatives that I've been involved in, and certainly Vish and Kelvin will also discuss briefly what they've been involved in. And again, my hope is that you will see a bit of overlap between these data programs and data projects and what you do in clinical trials. And I think that the premise of all this is that when we do a clinical trial, our hope is ultimately to improve access to new medications and new interventions, but also improve care. And I think RWE does play a huge role in terms of filling some of the gaps that a trial cannot adequately address. So with that, I'll hand over to the next speaker. I know Vish had messaged me that he has a hard stop. So if it's not too difficult, he might go next instead of Kelvin. And so this way, if he has to sign off, he can still finish his talk.
Great, thanks, Winson. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Great, so I'll just share my presentation, just bear with me. Hopefully you can see that. Fingers crossed. I'll start going and then someone will tell me, I'm sure, if you can't see it. So thanks, Winson. I'm sad that I can't be with you. I'm calling from Calgary, where it's -5. So it's a chilly Calgary, and I hope you guys are warmer there in Montreal. I want to show how my group uses RWE to help inform treatment decisions and make the right choices for patients in the clinic, and how we have tried to inform the landscape for how solid cancers are treated in Canada. These are my disclosures. So I borrowed this cartoon on the left from my colleague Paul Wheatley-Price, a recent paper he wrote in Current Oncology, to talk about how Byzantine the process is for drug reimbursement in Canada, and how many different steps or need to be taken And the picture reminded me of an Escher painting, with staircases at impossible angles, because it does take a very long time for new medicines to be reviewed and funded in Canada. Not only does it have to go through HTA assessments, and I know all of us are involved in those assessments on this panel, but also then PCPA negotiations and, uniquely provincial listings in sequence in each province based on provincial discussions with the drug sponsor. So it does take a very long time, and it can look and feel very complex. So the corollary of that is that there are delays to the clinic. And when you look at the availability of new cancer drugs in this country over the last 5 years, marketing authorizations, and then ones that are actually listed on a public formulary, we lag behind comparable jurisdictions like the EU and the United States. Not only do we lag behind in terms of listings, but the waits for new cancer drugs can be very long. So the total waits were nicely outlined by Brett Skinner here recently, and may take many years for a drug to be launched, listed, and reimbursed in Canada. And can take many multiples of the time it takes in the United States or the European Union for the same drug, for the same indication. And so I guess we have to think as a society about the knock-on effects of this on our patients in the clinic when we have new drugs with meaningful improvements in time to event endpoints or quality of life, and the delays that patients have to undergo before they're able to receive them. And at that point, I think that's where RWD can help inform those treatment decision-making processes. So when I sit on these panels with the regulator, with CADIT, and we have a sponsor come to us for a new listing, often Canada may have not been included as a site for a clinical trial. We may not have a Canadian understanding of what the impact of that drug may be, or what the unmet need is in that patient population. And so a common pushback to colleagues in the industry is that we need a Canadian lens on this drug or this patient population, and you need to understand or outline the unmet need or the current standard of care in Canada, especially if your clinical trial does not have many Canadian sites. And often there is a gap here from the industry point of view, and RWD is not included in the submission. And it's one thing that helps inform the regulators a lot in terms of what is the potential role of this drug and need for this drug, and helps us make those critical decisions when it comes to whether we should list this drug, under what conditions, and to what patient population that may offer the most benefit. So I think that's an important piece for RWD that often is not done as much as it should be from an industry point of view. RWD, just from a clarity point of view versus real world evidence, RWE, as per the agency in the United States, RWD is patient health status, collected from a variety of sources, but RWE is this data being analyzed with clear questions and hypotheses to help drive a discussion about the risks and benefits of a drug or an intervention in a population. Now, taking this into context, my group has, for example, in the kidney cancer space, we recently worked on a project with a small molecule called cabozantinib in a large data set that Daniel Hain leads, the IMDC in kidney cancer, to understand where this drug cabozantinib is used and how good it is in a population of patients treated with metastatic kidney cancer. The background to this is that cabozantinib in Canada is only reimbursed in a very specific manner in the third line context, so after 2 previous treatment lines, whereas in the United Kingdom and Australia, where I previously practiced, there is no limitation to the reimbursement criteria like that. So we're allowed to use this drug as we see fit as clinicians. So we took 300 patients and 350 patients globally that were all treated with this drug, and we mapped out their treatment pathways and their survival. And we identified that the survival is similar with this drug, irrespective of the drugs that came before it. So the previous treatments had no difference to the effectiveness of this drug in this patient population. And that's what these curves show. And so this has gone to CADIF now to help inform the submission by the sponsor to help move cabozantinib, which is currently given in the third line in Alberta here, into the second line context, because it actually has the most data of any small molecule TKI in this space in the modern immunotherapy era, post-immunotherapy drugs. And in Australia, you can use it wherever you like. So I think this is a small example of how RWD done on annotated data sets with high quality without missing this from institutions that do this at high volume, interrogated in appropriate manners, can really help inform the regulatory discussion about access to drugs, which, as I've shown before, can be unfortunately lacking in this jurisdiction. So moving swiftly on to the other uses of real-world evidence as I see them. We have a lot of treatment options in a lot of cancers, and it's important that patients often ask us, how will we do on this medicine? And we can quote them clinical trial data, but as Winson said, that often doesn't inform them about how the drug performs in routine clinical practice. And a patient in front of me often is not very similar to a highly selected patient population in a clinical trial. So we've created prognostic scoring systems in both lung cancer here and melanoma, which I'll show you later, using simple baseline tests. Blood tests done routinely, like a full blood count and lactate dehydrogenase, and clinicians' routine assessment of a patient to help prognosticate how patients will do and outline how long they're likely to survive based on the drugs that they are given. So we've done this in lung cancer here and created a scoring system that's been published and replicated by a few different other groups. We call it the light risk criteria. And we did the same thing in melanoma as well, using very similar tools. So we hope, by doing this, we identified a group of patients that are likely to live on average only 2 months with this drug, and another group that are likely to live over 5 years with this drug, both at the same stage of their disease. And there are a few nuances to this, but broadly, that can help inform patients' decisions and clinicians' decisions about whether administration of this drug and balancing its risks and benefits is in the patient's best interest. So this is the other big use, I think, of real-world evidence to help treatment decision-making across solid tumors. So with that, I'll pause and we'll invite Kelvin to kindly talk to us about his experiences at Sunnybrook.
Thank you, Vish, and thank you for the organizing committee for inviting me to return to speak about real-world evidence and real-world data. Not sure if my slide's ready. Maybe I'll wait for a second. Thank you. Yeah, and by the way, I apologize for being the person who stands between you and lunch. It's always difficult to be the last person, but I'll try to be efficient. So again, I'll be speaking about exploring real-world data to generate real-world evidence in the cancer space in Canada. And a few years ago, before COVID, I had a good opportunity to share with this audience about some of the blue sky view, some of the concepts about coming up with a framework to generate real-world evidence to inform cancer drug decision-making. And so today I want to, Today I want to share with you some of the lessons that we have learned specifically about data. One of the things that when we are conceptualizing real-world data, what does it mean when we talk about patient-centered real-world data? And actually some of the speakers today already touched on some of the concepts. And to me, I really want to make sure that no patients are left behind. We have talked about underserved or underrepresented patient population or patient population that's actually deemed to be ineligible for some of the clinical studies. And so one of the advantages of obviously looking at population-based data is that we can look at everyone, and so that we can learn from everyone's trajectory. And also some of the speakers before me have spoken about there are many different types of data, data about patient characteristics, patients about their interaction and journey within the health system and their outcomes. So another feature to me about patient-centered real-world data is no patient's data are left behind. So that's why we're thinking about some of the data sources, hopefully that will capture everyone. We have also talked about learning healthcare system. And again, in the blue sky view, we want to think about a health system that can learn that every patient's characteristics and experience are available for studying. And ideally, that we can learn from the best practice knowledge, having it being available for decision-making and guiding decisions. And hopefully the improvement is in a continuous process through ongoing learnings, and ideally happening routinely, economically, and almost invisibly in the background. I mean, that's quite a bit of a blue sky view, but that's very different than the way we're operating right now, where we have one problem, we define one question, one study, collect one set of data, interpret the results. And often we may not even know who the right knowledge user is to actually implement a change. So ideally, we want to close that loop by having pre-planned tailored message depending on the results to the right knowledge user, so that we can actually have some changes in practice or decisions. And after a change in practice, we want to continue to have the data to monitor and see what the impact it has on our patients and in the system. So if we apply that type of concept in cancer drug fundings, we can potentially aim to promote accessibility, excellence, and sustainability. So for example, if we identify uncertainties upfront at market entry, certainly clinical trials, some of those will provide a lot of great evidence and promise about the drug entering into the market. But often there will be uncertainties, and often could be based on underrepresented patient groups, and sometimes based on certain endpoints. And if there are ways to think about conditional reimbursements of the drug to cover all those uncertainties, at least for us to be studying, have standardized ways to collect the data and to analyze the data, standardized way of reporting the results and have it reassessed, and then depending on the results, some specific tailored messages to the right knowledge user or decision makers, so that actions can be taken, and then mechanisms to implement those changes, and then we complete the loop and then continue to monitor the system for the changes in practice. That would be perfect if possible. So clearly that's a very data-intensive endeavor. So a few years ago, we were thinking about different working groups that need to be established just to even start to understand the problem. So with a few of the different working groups, I want to share some of the lessons from the data working group. It was initially chaired by Dr. Claire de Oliveira. We have the good fortune that Winson has agreed to become our chair starting this year. So we're working on a pan-Canadian collaboration involving all 10 provinces. Starting in 2018, the two key projects. One is to map out all the Canadian data assets across all the provinces, each of the databases that may be relevant for conducting real-world evidence studies. And the second objective is to actually conduct multi-provincial real-world studies. That will be probably the ultimate way to figure out whether the quality of the data is sufficient to inform decisions, and where are the strengths and where are the limitations. So some high-level results here. So far, we have identified 96 databases held across the country that would be relevant for real-world study. So on average, 9 databases per province, because we have 10 provinces here, and we're not counting the territories at this point. And the database is often held by multiple different data owners and custodians. Typically, some of those are from the Ministry of Health or Departments of Health, some from the provincial cancer agencies, and some in third-party organizations as well. And in terms of, for example, hospital data, they are being collected and often reported to CIHI, the Canadian Institute of Hospital Information. But the level of reporting and the periods that they covered also varies quite a bit from province to province. So that, again, is one of the examples of the interprovincial variability that we face in Canada. So, for example, most of the provinces are reporting fully about their inpatient data to CAI. But for emerge visits, only Ontario and Alberta are fully reporting to CAI. So by working through all those data sets, we also try to look at as many data variables that we think is relevant for conducting comparative effectiveness study, and then try to map out each of those elements against those databases across all the provinces. So what we have come up with is that there's a list of data elements that we think it's fairly consistently available across all 10 provinces. So this is where I've listed in this slide the so-called essential cancer real-world data table. Essentially, it's really a minimal list of variables that will allow us to at least start to consider a real-world study. We cannot create the perfect or ideal real-world study from this minimal set, but at least this set, it's kind of the base, the backbone for future study. So the data that's contained here include demographic data from population registry, cancer diagnosis. Ooh, can we go back? There you go. Okay, cancer diagnosis data from cancer registry, treatment data regarding patients' journey through different treatment modalities, survival data, as well as health research utilization through physician billings in terms of clinical services. And beyond that, we try to look at other data elements. So again, this is a slide that seems to be color-coded like red, yellow, green, like a traffic light. Each of the columns are representing one province, so there are 10 columns there. Red just simply means that the data is not available. Green means that the data is available and likely usable. And yellow means that the data is available with some caveats. And often the caveats include its availability over a historical period of time, its linkability or accessibility. So far, some of those variables that will be important and fall into this category, such simple things such as height and weight data, which is important for dosing and monitoring of intensity of the dose of treatment, comorbidities, intent of treatment, line of therapy, emerge visit, and patient-reported outcomes that Winson has also alluded to, and we may have more speakers later on to talk about this. And we won't have time for this today, but through our journey, we have actually conducted a few comparative effectiveness and safety study looking at the difference between the clinical trials results versus real-world experience by our patients. We've also conducted a cost-effectiveness study looking at how it may or may not differ comparing to the clinical trials projection cost-effectiveness upfront versus the real-world cost-effectiveness. And along the way, we also have received a lot of valuable inputs from various stakeholders, including patients and patient groups. And we have conducted a few patient engagement activities as well along the way. So looking forward into the future, we're now at 2023. We are hopeful that we'll be completing our 9-province comparative effectiveness safety study and cost effectiveness study by the end of this year under the leadership of Winson, as well as completing the final data working group report, which we'll hopefully share with all the stakeholders and seek feedback for future purposes. And on my last two slides, I want to share with you something that's also very interesting and exciting from my perspective. Through the lessons that we've learned in the past few years in terms of data availability and accessibility and the time to access, we have established an entity called the CCRE, the Canadian Cancer Real-World Evaluation Platform. We are a part of a member supporting CADA's post-market drug evaluation collab network. And so we are one of the core network members, and the basis, the main investigators are from Ontario, Alberta, BC, and HDRN. And again, gives me another opportunity to work with Winson and Stuart and Mina Tedros and Kim McGrail and others that you may know. And the aim of CCRA is to respond to queries from senior healthcare decision makers about safety and effectiveness of post-market oncology therapies. And the aim is to provide customer-focused, timely, and rigorous response to the submitted queries. And we hope that this is one small step towards creating a learning health system in the oncology space. So this is one of our first queries that it's currently under external consultation. We also have the privilege to work with Exactus, and Exactus is also a member of CoLab as well. And so this allows us to also combine data from Quebec along with Ontario, Alberta, and BC, so 4 of the largest provinces in Canada. So with that, I would like to thank you, and hopefully we'll be ready to enjoy lunch.
I think it's on now. Okay, great. So I'm cognizant of the fact that our session started about half an hour late, and Vish also has to leave at on the hour, and I think we're all hungry for lunch too. So I'll probably abbreviate the Q&A session, but if there are questions right now, we'll be happy to address them if there are any. If not, maybe I'll start asking Vish and Kelvin one particular question, which is, RWE, I think, is certainly has become a lot more topical in the last 4 to 5 years, and I think the interest, at least from me, has always been, how can we leverage it more fully to actually impact healthcare decisions and also payer decisions? So in your experience, have you had any success or maybe anecdotes in terms of how it has influenced either a care pathway or a payer decision or a reimbursement sort of decision? Again, because Vish has to leave, maybe I'll start with Vish first and then go to Kelvin after.
Thanks, Winson. So there are discrete examples of where RWE has been used by regulators and payers to improve a medicine. So an example would be, rare populations where it's very difficult to perform more, randomized controlled trials. So palbociclib, CDK4/6 inhibitor in breast cancer, was approved in male breast cancer based on high quality RWE from population-based data on its use in the United States, and the FDA approved that contingent on that data. So, and now it's used routinely for male endocrine-positive breast cancer. So, I think there are very clear examples of in rare populations, especially where it's incredibly hard to recruit for randomized, sufficiently powered, phase 3s, where RWE has a very important role, and it's encouraging that regulators and payers are seeing that too. Kelvin, keen for your thoughts.
Thanks. Yeah, actually, in Ontario, there was actually a good example about using RWE to inform decision-making or in terms of cancer drug funding or pathways. This may not have been very well advertised, but actually it's also a good example where it's prospectively planned for collecting RWD and then to analyze and then to try to inform decision making instead of more like an afterthought, because a lot of the situations often it was not prospectively planned. So in this particular example, it's actually for azacitidine in myelodysplastic syndrome. And the interesting feature about this was that the entry of the drug was based on a controlled trial showing the efficacy of azacitidine. But the original schedule of azacitidine is not very patient-centered or system-centered. It's 7 days in a row, IV. So you can imagine that 7 days in a row, it's kind of hard to schedule when you have Saturdays and Sundays in a way, and in Canada, sometimes occasionally the Monday as well for long holidays. So during implementation, the planning for the implementation, people realize that this is going to be a challenge for the system and for patients. So they allow for 2 other alternative schedule, even though without evidence, direct evidence. So they allow for a 6-day schedule, and they allow for also 5+2+2, meaning that 5 days, skip the weekend, and then 2 days. And they plan prospectively to collect the data and then analyze it, and then bring it back officially to the Ontario HTA committee, which is called the Ontario Steering Committee of Cancer Drugs. So it took some time, and I think a lot of lessons learned about, prospectively plan for sample size, plan for power calculations, all the good things that people would do for RCTs. Obviously, that's an example in the early days we're talking about, in 10 plus years ago when this was first planned. But eventually, the analysis was conducted and was brought back to the Ontario Steering Committee of Cancer Drugs and evaluated by the committee members, and the recommendations was made. And the result actually showed that all three regimens looks the same in terms of the overall survival endpoint. We could nitpick about some statistics, some analytics, some power, but generally there's really no major features that raise concerns about survival or safety. And at the end, then all the three protocols were then implemented fully. That's allowed. So that's kind of one nice example, at least in Canada, that can happen. So I think knowing that example at least gives us some hope and inspiration that there's actually possibilities to do this type of analysis to have impact.
Great, thanks. I guess my last question, if there are no other ones, one of the themes of this conference is also, how we embed clinical trials, how we embed, RWD&E within routine clinical practice. But another sort of related theme is also patient engagement and being patient-centric. So in a lot of our RWE studies, I'm wondering whether, either Vish or Kelvin has any comments in terms of how, patients are engaged or consulted in designing these initiatives. And if there are examples, I think the audience would be really keen to hear about them. Any thoughts on that, Kelvin or Vish?
I can start first. Maybe drawing from a more recent examples, and Winson, you're also involved with the same example as well, which is the niraparib example that we're working with CADF, CCRE, and Exactis. I think that this is where CADF, because of their experience with engaging patients, actually can lead the way and continue to improve upon patient engagement with these projects. So in our example, patient groups was involved very early on in terms of the protocol development, as mostly about protocol review as well, just to make sure that any concerns from the patient group's perspective or any feedback or suggestions were collected upfront before the protocol is finalized. And also there's also a cycle at the end when the results becomes available. They are also being asked to provide comments and feedback about the results and their thoughts and interpretation as well. So I feel like this is definitely the right direction, that we are increasingly involving patients iteratively throughout the development of RWE.
Great, thanks.
Thanks.
Vish?
So we recently gained funding from an industry sponsor to create a fellowship that focuses on research that is patient-centric, and RWE is a beautiful thing that can do that. So clinical trials look at hard endpoints, survival, imaging responses, and quality of life. But they don't include things like patients' distance from the cancer center or patients' socioeconomic status. And these things actually make a huge difference into the types of therapies that clinicians choose and how patients are able to tolerate those therapies and how long they live on those therapies. So we're undertaking a few different projects that look at these social determinants of health, and I'm trying to understand how they influence treatment decisions and benefit and toxicities on therapy. So we're trying to become less hard endpoint obsessed with our RWE, because we have been like that for a long time, and try and become more patient-centric in our approaches.
That's great. I mean, my last comment would be that in Alberta, like many other provinces, we also have a very strong patient family advisory council, and they're always available to kind of consult and engage when it comes to grant applications and also project proposals. So they've been quite involved in a lot of the O2, like my team's project. So it's been really nice to kind of get that patient voice early on, as opposed to just involving them at the tail end of during knowledge transfer. So having them involved has been really, really helpful. So. I don't see any other questions or comments, so I think I'll. Oh.
So thank you for your excellent presentations. Just a quick question for Kelvin. I was thinking, as you were doing your outline of the different real-world evidence databases from province to province, whether you've given any thought on how to link those databases together in order to share that information for the development of these programs.
Right. So I think when you mean by linking, it's linking across the different provinces, right? That's actually the holy grail in Canada. I think probably require a lot of top-down willingness to proceed with that, and certainly it's a problem that we recognize, because even in the diseases such as cancer and common cancers, once we start to look at underrepresented groups, the sample size will become smaller in each of the provinces, and also for some of the biomarker-driven scenarios, again, sample size becomes very small. So I think you highlighted a very important question. We don't have an immediate solution, but I think the fact that we're actually working on these projects, and these projects often heavily involving decision makers, senior decision makers, who wants the results of these projects. Over time, we are trying to socialize increasingly about the importance about being able to share data across provincial boundaries. And even recently, when we talk about opportunities and what we should be focusing on, this was raised as one of the top items that we want to really focus on. I feel like this is something that collectively as a group, like all of us and all the different stakeholders, should continue to socialize the importance of having that. Don't know what the future will bring for pharmacare or Canadian Drug Agency. That has been talked about often in the media. But I would hope to think that one of the mandates or one of the levers through those initiatives will be to help break down these provincial boundaries, which will be key to any successful learning health system in Canada as a country. Thank you.
Great. I want to thank Vishal and Kelvin for their time today, and I'll hand it back over to Anne-Marie.